Thank you, and thank you for that introduction. Thanks to Mel and Jason and the other organisers for inviting me here to such a special place. I really am very impressed with where you're hosting your Hepatitis C conference, a world apart, I tell you, from where we host ours in Scotland, but I will be going back and telling them that we need to raise our game, I think. Okay, so I'm going to give you an overview and a quick run-through of Scotland's action plan on hepatitis C, in terms of the background and the evidence which really informed the action plan, what progress we've made over the last 6 to 7 years, and also the future challenges that lie ahead in terms of diagnosing, treating infection, and preventing infection and disease. Before I get into that, I thought it might be helpful to set the scene a little bit and draw some comparisons between our two countries. Canada obviously is vastly bigger, larger population than what Scotland has. Scotland has 5 million people living there, but our prevalence of hepatitis C is actually remarkably similar. 0.7% of the populations are chronically infected, and the majority of people have acquired their infection through injecting drug use. In Scotland, we estimate around 85 to 90% of people have acquired it through drug use. Slightly less that in Canada, but from the talk this morning by Curtis, I calculate about a quarter of your infected population are individuals who are actively injecting drugs. I think we're probably about the same in Scotland as well, about 20 to 25%. So the difference, I think, here relates to those individuals who've injected in the past and no longer inject. And we certainly estimate that to be a larger proportion of our infected population in Scotland. In terms of diagnosis, well, Canada has done better than us in that respect, with 70% diagnosed. We're up at 55%, and we've made some progress there, but still a long way to go. Interestingly, in terms of disease stage, very similar as well. About 60% of our infected populations have mild disease. And on the treatment front, we now treat around 3% of our infected population each year, and I'll come on to show you how we've managed to scale that up. But still, nevertheless, treatment rates across the two countries remain relatively low. So these are the latest estimates, and I just want to take you back really to the start of the action plan, where we had 3 aims of the action plan: to prevent infection, and that focused in on people who injected drugs, PWID. Also to diagnose infection and to treat ensure those that are infected receive optimal treatment, care and support. And we've had 3 phases of our action plan so far. We're just about to go into our 4th phase in April of this year. Phase 1, which kicked off in 2006, was really about generating and bringing together all of the evidence to put together a business case to Scottish Government to increase efforts and the response to hepatitis C. And phase 2 and phase 3 was all about developing services to prevent, diagnose and treat infection, and Scottish Government backed that and supported it with significant investment. So since 2008, some £100 million, so that's about 200 million Canadian dollars, have been invested in hepatitis C. And these were some of the key data that we had that went into that phase 1 business case, and outlined the landscape in Scotland in respect of hepatitis C. So we had around 38,000 people that were chronically infected, but under 40% of them had ever been diagnosed with their infection. Under 10% of them were attending a specialist centre routinely every year, and only 1% of that chronic population were going on to therapy each year. And that was against this backdrop where the numbers of people with hepatitis C that were developing liver failure each year, there's already evidence that that had risen. And this modelling work illustrated that that was going to continue to rise over the next 10, 20 years if we didn't scale up therapy to this population. We needed to scale up therapy to around 2,000 individuals each year. That's a considerable jump from only a few hundred that were being initiated on therapy before the action plan. Only if we increased the numbers going on to therapy to around 2,000 would we see a curbing in the number of liver failures. And that obviously is in the context of pegylated interferon and ribavirin. But these are the key data that got Scottish Government switched on to hepatitis C. And associated with that, we obviously generate the costs as well that was going to impact on our National Health Service. Now, there's a number of principles and characteristics that are worthy of note. I've mentioned the strong evidence base. Within the Phase 2 action plan, there was around 30 very high-level actions that were all geared to improving services in terms of prevention, diagnosis and treatment. And these were high level. So the health boards, there's 14 NHS health boards across Scotland, and these are responsible for delivering these services, and they had a bit of freedom given the high level nature of these actions to improve services in the context of their current arrangements and in the context of their epidemiology. Strong governance and clear accountability. Organisations that were giving the additional funding were held accountable to Scottish Government, and they had to report regularly on progress. Leadership was key, both nationally. There was a national organisation that coordinated, it was the Infectious Diseases Centre, and locally there was also leadership. So there was an appointment of an executive, hepatitis C executive lead, a clinical lead, a prevention lead. The executive lead, for example, had responsibility for the budget and for demonstrated progress was being made. Very much a multidisciplinary approach was adopted, serious investment, and a strong focus on measuring performance. For example, a lot of the funding that was allocated was about increasing the numbers of people going on to therapy, and in terms of funding drug therapy, and so there were annual Scottish Government targets introduced and monitored to ensure health boards were making progress in terms of treating individuals with hepatitis C. And these are just some of the high level actions in terms of prevention, diagnosis and treatment. And in terms of prevention, the big action here was about providing funding to local health boards to increase and improve the provision of injecting equipment to PWID. Diagnosis, health boards were given funding to develop new, novel approaches to testing and diagnosing people within the community setting. Treatment, a substantial amount of funding went to increase the clinical capacity, and also we introduced national procurement of antiviral therapy, and that enabled a 20% saving in drug costs across the country. So in terms of progress that's been made here, first looking in terms of prevention, and we did see progress made in terms of improving and increasing the coverage of injecting equipment to the PWID population, particularly in terms of paraphernalia. Very limited paraphernalia that was given out before the action plan, and that was really scaled up during the action plan. Methadone, which wasn't linked to the Hep C action plan, but is linked to another government plan on drug use, efforts were made in terms of getting people onto methadone. And you can see here, actually, a quite high proportion of our injecting population are on methadone. In terms of treatment, a bit of progress here in terms of scaling up therapy amongst the population who were actively injecting drugs, doubling there, but still treatment in that population is still relatively low, relating to only 10% of our treatment initiates relate to active injectors. And And on the right-hand side here, these are the data that demonstrate the impact in terms of incidence of hepatitis C. And we got very excited when we saw the first 3 sweeps of data showing a downward trend in the transmission of hepatitis C. But since then, most recent data that we've got indicates a stabling in that incidence curve. So we believe that we have made a bit of progress here in terms of reducing the incidence of hepatitis C in line with the scale up in interventions, but by no means have we controlled the spread of infection in this population, and highlights how aggressive you actually have to be to reduce transmission with these harm reduction measures. I don't think alone the provision of injecting equipment and methadone, and certainly the modelling work would support that. These interventions alone are not going to control the spread of infection in this population. Modelling work does suggest, though, if we scale up treatment of hepatitis C in this population, we might make greater inroads there to controlling the spread of infection. That's the modelling work. We still need to work on evaluating that. In terms of diagnosis, we've seen a jump in the numbers of people that have been diagnosed. These are new diagnoses with hepatitis C, jumping from around 1,500 each year to around 2,000 each year we observe now. And that jump can be attributed to the introduction of dry blood spot testing that was rolled out in drug treatment services since 2009. The graph here, you can see at 2009, the numbers that have been tested and diagnosed really rocketed in that setting. And about 15 to 20% of our new diagnoses now are associated with testing going on in drug treatment services. And that has translated to a rise in the proportion of our infected population that are diagnosed. For around 38% at the start of the action plan, we're over 50%, 55% we estimate are now diagnosed. That places us at the upper end internationally in terms of diagnosis rates. But you can see here that we've still got a long way to go to diagnose not just the majority, but the vast majority of our infected population. It could take another decade to get up to 80%. So we really need to increase our efforts in terms of diagnosing infection. On the treatment front, we've also seen a jump in the numbers of people that have been initiated on therapy, a 2 to 2.5 fold rise in treatment initiates each year. It has, we've reached a ceiling of around 1,000 treated each year, and that in recent years probably relates a lot to the prospect of all the new therapies that are going to come online. Within the prison setting, health boards set up new arrangements, new contracts with the prison services to allow testing and treatment within the prison setting. And we saw a 7-fold rise in treatment initiations within the prison setting. And the great majority of people that are now initiated on therapy have a history of injecting drug use. Around 80% have a history of injecting drug use. Around 60% are people who are on opiate substitute therapy. So again, great inroads that's been made in terms of linking up with drug treatment services. And so here a corner has been turned during the course of our action plan, whereas at the beginning of the action plan, the numbers of people that were chronically infected were rising year on year. And as a result of our efforts in terms of scaling up prevention activities, scaling up treatment, then we now estimate that we've got a downward trend in the numbers of people that are chronically infected. Had we not scaled that up, we could have been looking at around 42,000 people that would have been chronically infected. Instead, we're looking at around 37,000 people that we estimated are now chronically infected. So we've scaled up treatment from 1% of our infected population were treated at the start of the action plan, now 3% treated, but it's still a relatively low rate of treatment initiation. So these are just a summary of the achievements that we've made in terms of diagnosis. We're now 55% of the population are diagnosed. In terms of treatment, we've seen a tripling in the numbers of people that are clearing the virus through therapy. And in terms of the numbers of people that are chronically infected, we've seen some progress there in terms of a reduction. Now, I'm going to highlight just a number of the key challenges that are facing us in Scotland. There's going to be many challenges, I'm sure, that lie ahead, and also opportunities. But I've just picked out a couple of these key challenges. And here I've already highlighted that while we've made progress in terms of diagnosing, we're still left with 45% of our infected population that are unaware of that infection. And so we do need to increase our efforts in that respect. In terms of people coming in and accessing specialist care, we've also made progress. There's around 3,500 people each year coming into services at the start of the action plan. That's up to close to 6,000 now. But nevertheless, we've still got around 70% of our diagnosed population that are not routinely being monitored within specialist services. And that really needs to be looked at more closely. This is another key challenge for us. A lot of progress I've shown you has been made, but nevertheless, the numbers of people that with hepatitis C and developing either end-stage liver disease or liver cancer each year are continuing to rise. We saw a bit of a plateauing in recent years, around 150 cases, but the most recent data, I think, are quite alarming. That shows that this is continuing to rise, and this must be a priority for us going forward, particularly in an era of highly effective antiviral therapies. These cases are preventable. The other major challenge, and probably our biggest challenge, and has already been highlighted today, is the costs. Even in Scotland, which has got a very well-resourced national action plan, we are struggling to cope with the costs of antiviral therapy. And here's just some rough costs. If we continue to treat 1,000 people per year, and I've estimated here just a ballpark figure of £25,000 per course of therapy, as 50,000 Canadian dollars, then we're looking at £25 million being spent each year on therapy. Now, obviously, the demand for therapy is going to increase. Well, if we were wanting to treat everybody that had ever come into specialist services, then we'd have to scale that up to £250 million. If we want to treat everyone that's ever been diagnosed, then that's £500 million. And if indeed we wish to treat everybody that's chronically infected, then we're getting on close to £1 billion. And that for Scotland relates to around about 1/10 of their annual health budget. So we just seriously can't afford this, and there's going to have to be some tough choices going forward in light of the costs. Just going back to diagnosis. And I've said we've made progress in terms of diagnosing people, particularly in drug treatment services. But of course, these tend to be at the younger age of the spectrum. And this modelling work highlights that we actually really need to do more in terms of diagnosing people in the older age group here, and the 35 to 64 years. We've got around 70% of our undiagnosed population in that older age group. So greater effort needed in the older cohort. And so where are we going to identify these individuals? Well, drug treatment services in prison, we've made great inroads there, but they, as you can see here, they tend to involve diagnosing people that are in the age group 15 to 34, 35, in the late 30s, early 40s in this group. Within general practice, however, we are managing to tap into a greater proportion of people that are in that older age group. Here, almost 20% that are over the age of 50 years. So GPs have a really important role here to play going forward in terms of diagnosis. And we have indeed in Scotland and in Glasgow evaluated different case-finding approaches in primary care, comparing a birth cohort type approach to a risk-based type approach. And certainly for us, we found that a risk-based type approach was more effective. In this approach, we did pay GPs to offer testing, and a systematic approach was applied where we searched within electronic GP databases to identify people that had risk factors, a history of having injecting drugs amongst this age group of 30 to 54 years. However, that evaluation data hasn't translated much across Scotland. There's been very limited implementation across Scotland. And I think that reflects how difficult it is to get GPs engaged with this. Of course, this was in the context of pegylated interferon via ribavirin, and I hope that GPs will embrace the new therapies, interferon-free therapies going forward. But certainly either with a risk-based approach or with a birth cohort approach, we really do need to get GPs more engaged. And then looking at the future targeting of therapy. And to do that, we really need to understand what a current targeting of therapy. And this is some data that we've recently published in Gut, which estimates that of our chronic infected population, around about 60% have mild disease. And interestingly, of the people that are going on to therapy each year, around about 60% of them also have mild disease. In contrast, we have a higher proportion of our treated population that had cirrhosis compared to that of our infected population. That reflects people with cirrhosis more symptomatic and coming in to services for therapy. The group that were under treatment, in contrast, is this moderate disease group, the F2s and the F3s. We're treating fewer of them compared to the wider infected population. So we've done some modelling work to look at what is the impact of different treatment strategies going forward with the new therapies, and looking at what impact it will make in terms of different outcomes. Here I've presented it in terms of severe liver morbidity, that's decompensated cirrhosis and HCC, and on the right-hand side here in terms of new infection. And we've looked at I've presented here three different strategies where we just go with the status quo. The second one here is targeting those with advanced fibrosis, so the F2 and above, and increasing that from 40% of those that initiated on treatment having advanced disease up to 60%. And the third strategy is about targeting those individuals who are actively injecting drugs. So with a treatment of 1,000 per year, continuing that, and with the status quo, the modelling suggested we should see some impact here in terms of a downward trend in the numbers of severe liver morbidity cases and also in terms of new infection. If we targeted advanced fibrosis cases, then of course we would see greater inroads in terms of reducing severe liver morbidity, but no change would be made in terms of new infection. In terms of targeting active PWID, of course, we'd make greater inroads in terms of reducing new transmission, but we wouldn't make any greater impact in terms of reducing severe liver morbidity. So this is quite intuitive, but with 1,000 treated each year and these treatment scenarios, you can see it's still going to take us another 15 years to make real appreciable reductions in these. And it's only really when we scale up therapy that we're going to see major reductions achieved within the next 5 or so years. So we'd need to increase the numbers of advanced fibrosis cases up to 60% of that treated population. What's that? About 1,200 each year. I mean, on the right-hand side here, we'd need to increase the numbers of active people who are actively injecting drugs up to around 600 to 700. That's from around 100 just now, in order to make greater inroads in terms of new transmission. Of course, we'd like to do both, but the cost of therapy is going to be a real major barrier for us in terms of doing that. And I think in the immediate term, and I mean in 2015, 2016, I anticipate Scotland, the Scottish Government, is going to focus in on reducing the numbers of cases of severe liver morbidity. Just wanted to touch upon here, you'll notice on this left-hand curve that we don't get the numbers of severe liver morbidity cases down to zero. And that obviously relates to other lifestyle factors that contribute to progression to these advanced disease cases. And these data also illustrate that point here where we compared the excess risk of liver-related morbidity post-treatment compared to the general population. And for those that didn't achieve an SVR, these individuals had a 50-fold excess risk of liver morbidity compared to the general population. That reduced to 10-fold amongst those who did clear the virus, achieve an SVR. So there's about a 5-fold difference here, 5-fold reduction with achieving SVR. But notably, we didn't get down to 1. So there's still an excess risk of liver morbidity, even if you remove those cases that had cirrhosis at the point that they went onto therapy. And this will be related, a lot in Scotland will be related to ongoing and heavy alcohol use and also other lifestyle factors. So we do and cannot ignore the importance of addressing these other lifestyle factors. So just to summarise, on the prevention side, the lessons that I think we've learned is that the high levels of provision of harm reduction interventions can reduce, but we believe can't fully control Hep C transmission in PUID. Treatment and prevent onward transmission amongst active injectors is a concept at the moment, but if indeed this can be translated into practice, then it will be very rewarding in an interferon-free era, particularly where we have lower costs for antiviral therapy. In terms of diagnosis, I've illustrated that dry blood spot testing within the non-clinical settings is highly, it's been highly acceptable and effective. In terms of risk-based screening, that's been effective, but only up to a point at the moment. And so we do need to renew our thinking on this, and we might need to employ a combination of both risk-based and population-based case finding, which might focus in on people of certain ages and in certain areas of high prevalence if we really do want to reach the great majority of infected people. On the treatment front, we've shown that optimising clinical services can lead to quite rapid scale-up in treatment. But again, we've reached a ceiling here in terms of treatment. But this has been in the context of interferon and in the context of secondary care. I've shown SVR prevents liver disease, but the impact on therapy can be compromised by the other lifestyle factors like alcohol. I've also shown you from the modelling work that it is theoretically possible to control the incidence of HCV-related severe liver disease going forward in the context of new therapies. And I think that, for us, is going to be a priority. And last but not least, I'd like to thank a large number of people that contribute to the data that I've presented today. Thank you very much for listening.
Great. Well, as people are making their way up to, we have a couple minutes for some questions. First, I'd like to personally thank Sharon on behalf of the organizing committee for coming and speaking today. I think the work that you and David Goldberg and the rest of your colleagues in Scotland has done is truly exceptional, and you guys are really at the leading edge globally in terms of addressing Hep C through your action plan. So it's great you could share this with us. So my quick question, and maybe it's not so quick because it's a tricky one. You provided us with a really nice sort of array of the evidence that was required to impact policymakers and to get them to listen. But from a practical perspective, how did you practically do this? What key meetings did you have to sort of set up? What about champions within government? You know, you had the evidence, and that was fantastic, that provided you with the ammunition, but what's unique about Scotland that got government policymakers to listen, to take action, and invest such a large amount of money into this initiative?
Yeah, you're right. It's a difficult one to answer. And I expect the doing a similar action plan in different countries is going to have to relate to the government situation and the current political context. So we were doing this at a time before we had the economic crisis. So the timing, I think, for us, we obviously were fortunate because of that timing. Having said that, we were at the time that we had suboptimal antiviral therapy, whereas the time now for people to capitalise is that we actually have got very highly effective therapies. And I think that is something that can switch on government to this. The data I've already mentioned, and I think highlighting, having data that demonstrate that this is going to cost government a lot going forward is really crucial. I think the setup, champions and leadership you've highlighted were so critical. I mean, it wasn't like we suddenly decided to have an action plan in 2005 and then suddenly had one in 2006. This took a bit of time to get up to 2006 and put this on the radar. We managed to get our chief medical officer interested, and indeed the CMO put together an initial strategy document for hepatitis C in Scotland, and was shared widely, and people didn't like it. There was a wide consultation on that, and people didn't like that. And so in response to that, there had to be a more coordinated approach to this. And it was really at that point where the national agency, it's called Health Protection Scotland, is the National Infectious Diseases Centre, really became involved at a leadership capacity and trying to bring together all of the stakeholders. And I had incredible support by doing that and bringing people together around the table. So leadership and champions is key. So the clinicians really made every effort to put this onto the ministers, an issue for them. We had a number of patient representative groups, Charles Gore, and other groups that were really highlighting this amongst ministers. I don't know I'm not as familiar with what the situation here is in Canada. I think Scotland wants to address inequalities. Is right at the heart and cross-cuts across a lot of their political agendas. And we made a big focus in on how hepatitis C affected, more than any other condition, affects those living in the most deprived parts of society. I think it's about 75% of our infected population lived in areas of high deprivation, and it's far higher than cancer and all these other conditions. And I think that again switched on government. Now, I'm not saying I don't know whether that will switch on Canada, but you need to understand what might switch the government on here. The other thing I'll say is that we had very close contacts with civil servants. Sorry, so you got pretty close. You give me a really long question. I'll finish up. Having a close arrangement with civil servants to work with the government in terms of putting an action plan has been really central, and we continue to have very good relations with civil servants.
Thank you. You just answered my question.
Oh, was that? Great.
Thank you. That's deeply appreciated because we have our challenges in Canada to move this forward. Thank you very, very much.